A History of the Episcopal Church by Robert Pritchard. Chapter 2. The Age of Reason and the American Colonies, 1688 to 1740. In 1688, the Parliament invited James II's Protestant son-in-law and daughter from Holland to assume jointly the British throne as King William III, 1688 to 1702, and Queen Mary II, 1688 to 1694. Mary's younger sister Anne supported their accession and succeeded them as monarch, 1702 to 1714. Collectively, the reign of the three marked as an important turning point in the religious life of England and her colonies. Well aware of the turmoil that preceded them, the monarch sought to quiet the tempers of English subjects by adopting a series of practical compromises: retention of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles, adoption of an Act of Toleration for Protestant dissenters, and granting of broader authority to Parliament. In Scotland, a separate kingdom with a shared monarch until united with England in 1707, they abandoned their predecessor's attempt to conform the Church to that in England. The Church of Scotland would thereafter be Presbyterian. These measures were successful in maintaining the peace. The Glorious Revolution was the last revolution of the English people. The peace in England was due not only to specific legislation, but also to a number of people who advanced new ways of thinking about English religion and society. The impact of this shift would be felt by English colonists in the New World. While it is impossible to point to all those involved in bringing the moderate Enlightenment to England following the Glorious Revolution, it is possible to single out two important groups: the Royal Society and the latitudinarian bishops. The Royal Society. In 1649, a group of scholars at Oxford University began to meet informally in order to gain what one member called the satisfaction of breathing a freer air and of conversing in quiet with one another, without being engagged in the passions and the madness of that dismal age. In the midst of civil war and dogmatic debates, members of the group saw only the opportunity to discuss issues of common interest. At the Restoration, Charles II gave a group a charter, 1662, and a name, the Royal Society. During the remainder of the 17th century, the Society's membership would include both prominent church figures and the leading intellectual lights of England. Chemist Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691, astronomer Edmund Halley, 1656 to 1742, philosopher John Locke, 1632 to 1704, mathematician Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, Bishop of Rochester Thomas Sprat, 1635 to 1713, Bishop of Salisbury Seth Ward, 1613 to 1689, Bishop of Chester John Wilkins, 1614 to 1712, and architect Christopher Wren, 1632 to 1723. Members of the Society shared a bold vision that a marriage of reason and faith provided a truly pious alternative to the violence that English Christians had experienced early in the century. They believed, moreover, that the vision would not only bring peace to the Church, but would also bring progress and prosperity to their nation. The same minds that solved religious controversies with patient application of reason could also solve scientific and mathematical problems, providing a basis for the continuing expansion of English industry, navigation, and trade. In the early 18th century, Society President Isaac Newton, 1703 to 1727, presided over a transition in the Society's focus. Church leaders played a declining role, and members focused more narrowly on scientific investigation. By that time, however, a broad spectrum of English Christians had accepted the vision of the Society's first generation as normative. John Locke's Reasonableness of Christianity, 1695, was a classic statement of the faith of the Society's first generation. In his work, Locke attempted to escape from the intense theological argumentation which had divided English Christians for most of his century, by characterizing the message of the New Testament with a few simple and logical propositions. Others, who were not themselves members of the society, supplemented Locke's exposition. In The Analogy of Religion, 1736, Bishop Joseph Butler, 1692 to 1752, explained that this reasonable Christianity was constant with the laws of nature. Catherine Cockburn, 1679 to 1749, a playwright who turned to theological writing, echoed similar themes. Christian belief, and most particularly the Anglican understanding of it, was a reasonable faith, whose propagation went hand in hand with domestic peace, scientific advancement, and the success of the British Empire. This vision deeply influenced English and colonial Christians of all denominations. The Latitudinarian Bishops. When William III and Mary II came to the throne, all the Scottish bishops and 7 English bishops, including Archbishop of Canterbury William Sancroft, refused to swear allegiance to the new king and queen. These non-juring bishops, i.e. bishops who refused to swear allegiance, would provide the apostolic succession for a dissenting church that would continue as a separate institution into the 19th century. It would be particularly strong in Scotland, where William and Mary agreed to a Church of Scotland with Presbyterian polity. Non-juring bishops from Scotland would consecrate American Samuel Seabury to the episcopate in 1784. The new monarchs and the Parliament removed the 7 English bishops from office and replaced them with popular London clergy who had supported the Glorious Revolution. Among the new appointees was Gilbert Burnet, 1643 to 1715, who became Bishop of Salisbury. John Tillotson, 1630 to 1694, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. Simon Patrick, 1627 to 1701, who became Bishop of Ely. And Edward Stillingfleet, 1635 to 1699, who became Bishop of Worcester. 3 of the 4 men had studied at Cambridge, and the 4th, Burnet, admitted that he was deeply influenced by a group of teachers there, particularly known as the Cambridge Platonists. Ralph Cudworth, 1617 to 1688, was the most influential of these teachers. Drawing on the work of the 3rd century Neoplatonic Egyptian philosopher Plotinus, they characterized religious faith as a mystery that could never be entirely reduced to logical propositions. The bishops who studied with the Platonists saw no conflict between this more mystical approach to theology and scientific investigation of the sort advocated by the members of the Royal Society. Burnet, a historian and an amateur chemist, joined the Royal Society in 1664. Patrick was a probable author of A Brief Account of the New Sect of Latitude Men, 1662, which explained that the Platonists encouraged science by freeing it from the metaphysical categories of Aristotelian thought. The bishop's approach dovetailed nicely with the Royal Society's vision of a reasonable faith in a second way. If one stretched practical morality and philanthropy rather than the difficult points of doctrine, it was far easier to show the reasonableness of the Christian faith. Shaped by this conviction, the new bishops argued for a wider toleration in the English Church. They questioned, for example, the need for the heated debate over predestination that divided English Protestants of their day and competing Calvinist and Arminian camps. Gilbert Burnet wrote an exposition of the 39 Articles, 1699, in which he suggested that either position was in keeping with the English 39 Articles. This advocacy for toleration soon earned the bishops the title Latitudinarian, a label that had also been used of their Cambridge teachers. Like the members of the Royal Society, the Latitudinarian bishops recognized the importance of the English colonies in America. They were a rich resource whose scientific management would bring prosperity to England. They were also diverse and divided religious communities to which a moderate enlightened Anglicanism could offer a unifying vision. Henry Compton, 1632 to 1713, the Bishop of London who, like the Latitudinarians, was a Cambridge graduate, was also an important figure in regard to the colonies in America. Before appointment to the See of London in 1675, Compton had served as Charles II's chaplain of the Chapel Royal. In that capacity, he had been responsible for the religious education of both Mary and Anne. He was an active supporter of the Glorious Revolution, and after it, he was a trusted advisor who was able to encourage royal patronage for religious and benevolent projects in the colonies. New legislation. In the last 2 decades of the 17th century, English monarchs gradually expanded the authority they exercised over the American colonies. In 1684, Charles II canceled the proprietary charters of Massachusetts and Bermuda, making the territories royal colonies. As Duke of York, James Stuart was himself the proprietor of New York, 1664, but after following his brother to the throne as James II, 1685, he added New York to the number of royal colonies. In 1691, William III and Mary II designated Maryland as a royal colony as well. With a larger number of the colonies directly under royal control, it became possible for sympathetic monarchs to follow policies favorable to the Anglican Church. William and Mary and Anne chose just such a course of action. They instructed their royal governors to lobby the colonial legislators for the establishment of the Church of England, an action that required subsequent approval by the English Privy Council. The policy was successful in Maryland, establishment in 1702, and South Carolina, 1706, and partially successful in New York. In 1693, the royal governor of New York persuaded the state assembly to adopt an act providing for Protestant clergy in New York City and in Richmond, Westchester, and Queens counties. The governor interpreted Protestant to mean Anglican, but a non-Anglican majority in the assembly made the system largely unworkable. It was unsuccessful in New Jersey. Queen Anne's successors would, however, later expand establishment to Nova Scotia, 1758, Georgia, 1758, and North Carolina, definitive legislation, in 1765. The colonial governments in these territories had the responsibility of founding and providing support for Anglican parishes. They fulfilled this responsibility most consistently in Maryland, a former Roman Catholic colony, in which a large percentage of the populace had always been Anglican, and in South Carolina. The colonial religious establishment was less successful in North Carolina and Georgia, both because of the late date of enactment and because of the presence of those who had chosen to settle there precisely because of dissatisfaction with the religious situation in Virginia and South Carolina. The late date of establishment would prove less detrimental in Nova Scotia because the church's favored status would not end with the American Revolution. While Anglicans in England were not in complete agreement about the wisdom of the church-state alliance that the English government expanded in America after 1688, many of them shared a common conception that was quite different from the dream for world evangelism of the first generation of colonists. Bishop of Gloucester, William Warburton, 1698 to 1779, would later explain this new understanding of the relationship of religion and nationhood in his Alliance Between Church and State, 1736. For him, the church was the soul of the state. It taught a natural religion to individuals who, as a result, became better citizens. Residents of the colonies with established Anglican churches came to share a similar opinion. For them, the Anglican Church and civic responsibility became increasingly intertwined. This integrated view would, however, create problems when the American Revolution severed the ties between church and state. Anglicans would not be able to expand their establishment to include all of the American colonies. With the exception of the partial establishment in New York, no colony between Maryland and Nova Scotia would have an established Anglican church. Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and other non-Anglicans were too firmly entrenched. The monarchs were, however, able to take steps to encourage and support individual Anglican congregations in those areas. Queen Anne, at the urging of the latitudinarian bishops, designated certain annates and tithes, which had been diverted to the state by Henry VIII, as a fund for the support of low-income clergy. From this fund, the so-called Queen Anne's bounty, she also authorized gifts to clergy willing to travel to the colonies as missionaries. In addition, the Queen made gifts to individual congregations. During this period, Anglicans founded their first parishes in Massachusetts, King's Chapel, Boston, 1688, Pennsylvania, Christ Church, Philadelphia, 1694, New York, Trinity, New York City, 1697, Rhode Island, Trinity, Newport, 1698, New Jersey, St. Mary's, Burlington, 1703, and Connecticut, Christ Church, Stratford, 1707. The commissary system. In England, bishops appointed representatives, called commissaries, to perform functions in distant portions of the diocese. In 1689, Henry Compton, the Bishop of London, 1685 to 1714, decided that he would use this system in the American colonies. Though the colonies were not formally a part of his diocese, governmental offices and commercial houses in his diocese controlled the commerce and government of the colonies. Finding no other provision for the supervision of colonial religion, Compton adapted the commissary system to provide some leadership for the Anglican Church in the colonies. In 1689, Compton appointed James Blair, 1656 to 1743, as his first commissary. Blair was already in Virginia. A Scot who had come to England with the support of latitudinarian Gilbert Burnet, Blair had escaped the uncomfortable reign of James II by volunteering for the mission field. He had quickly established roots in the colony, gaining an entry into the local gentry by marrying Sarah Harrison. Miss Harrison anticipated later liturgical revision of the Book of Common Prayer by refusing pointedly on 3 askings in the marriage service to say that she would obey her husband. As commissary in Virginia, Blair began to establish some order in the church. He set up a convocation system, sought to enforce morality laws, called annual conferences, proposed, but did not receive, ecclesiastical courts, and attempted to standardize the value of the tobacco in which clergy were paid. In 1693, Blair founded the College of William and Mary, the first Anglican institution of higher learning in the American colonies. The Virginia House of Burgesses agreed to the idea, and English contributors, whose number included Gilbert, Burnet, John Tillotson, and Robert Boyle, provided needed financial resources. Blair planned for his school to educate both Indians and colonists. The college proved more successful with the latter group than the former. A large portion of Virginia-born Anglican clergy who served in the colony before the Revolution would be graduates of William and Mary. Blair's success convinced Bishop Compton of the usefulness of the commissary system. Compton and his successors not only appointed commissaries for Maryland and the Carolinas, which, like Virginia, had Anglican establishment, but also for colonies in which Anglicans were a distinct minority. The commissary system reached its apogee during the episcopate of Edmund Gibson, Bishop of London, 1724-49. By the 1740s, commissaries were supervising Anglican clergy in 9 of the colonies. The commissary system had certain inherent weaknesses, however. So long as the colonial clergy were in relative agreement, the commissaries were effective spokesmen. In a number of circumstances, they were able to lobby effectively for the removal of colonial governors with whose policies they disagreed. They lacked, however, the canonical authority of a bishop, and were able to discipline errant clergy with only the greatest difficulty. Within a few years of the introduction of the first commissaries, therefore, some colonial Anglicans were already calling for resident bishops. In 1706, for example, 14 New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania clergy sent one of their number to England to plead for a colonial episcopate. By 1713, such advocates had caught the attention of Queen Anne. She instructed her chief minister to prepare legislation that would have authorized consecration of bishops for the colonies. Unfortunately, she died before any action could be taken. With Anne's death in 1714, any real possibility for a colonial episcopate was lost. Anne's successor, George I, had a limited knowledge of either the English language or the English Church. He delegated his right to appoint bishops to his prime ministers and left other issues of religious policy to the Parliament. In 1718 and 1719, a new Whig majority in Parliament replaced the Tory government that had defended the authority of the Church during Anne's reign. Rather than seeking to expand the sphere of influence for the episcopate, the Whigs sought to contract it. Parliament, for example, forbade the convocation of bishops to meet as a separate body, preferring to have Anglican prelates carry on their deliberations in the more public forum provided by the House of Lords, in which lay nobles and bishops met jointly. Some individual Anglicans continued, however, the campaign for a bishop after 1714. In 1718, for example, a number of clergy from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland signed a petition to the English bishops and archbishops requesting the appointment of a prelate. 6 years later, a call by New England clergy for a bishop brought philosopher and later Bishop George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, to Rhode Island as part of an unsuccessful effort to create a second Anglican college, and, the New England clergy hoped, a resident episcopate. Others on both sides of the Atlantic would sound similar calls throughout the remainder of the colonial period. It would only be after the American Revolution, however, that the Whigs in the English Parliament reversed their position to resident bishops. So long as the American colonies were part of the British Empire, they feared that an expanded episcopate would only support the authoritarian policies of the Tory party. An episcopate in a separate nation, however, would present no challenge to liberties back home. The Missionary Societies. First Commissary James Blair served in Virginia as commissary for 57 years. Bishop Compton's appointee in Maryland, Thomas Bray, 1656 to 1730, followed a very different course of action. Though chosen in 1696, Bray did not actually visit the colony itself until 1700. His initial efforts in Maryland were much like those of Blair in Virginia. He summoned a convocation of the clergy, charged them to teach the catechism to their parishioners, and cautioned one of their number about his scandalous conduct. He urged vestries to help in the suppression of evil conduct and raised an offering for the assistance of the Church of England in Pennsylvania. The establishment was new in Maryland, and the legislative act for which Bray successfully lobbied did not include any funds for his own salary. After less than 3 months in the colony, he sailed for England. He would not return to Maryland. Bray's major contribution, however, was not pastoral. It was organizational and educational. Bray had come to the attention of Bishop Compton because of his intellectual ability. He had been a scholarship student at Oxford, whose studies had advanced so quickly that he had graduated before the canonical age of ordination. He had written a popular set of catechetical lectures that was already in print in 1697. Once appointed by Compton, he immediately recognized the need for educational materials in the colonies. In 1698, he organized the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, SPCK, to which Princess Anne contributed £44 and Bishop Burnet $50 to purchase books for colonial libraries. In keeping with the Enlightenment marriage of science and religion, the titles included both works in theology and the natural sciences. Bray hoped that these SPCK libraries, which would eventually number almost 40, would be both tools for parish clergy and effective evangelical materials. Dissenters or non-Christians who read the books would learn of the reasonableness of the Anglican cause. Bray's inability to gain a stipend from the Maryland legislature convinced him that a missionary organization to support colonial clergy was also needed. He began to campaign for such a body. His A General View of the English Colonies in America with Respect to Religion, written before his visit to Maryland in 1698, had detailed the woeful condition of colonial Anglicanism. In all of New England, there was only one Anglican parish, the newly founded King's Chapel. Long Island had 13 dissenting churches and no Anglican parishes. East New Jersey had no Anglican church, and Pennsylvania only one. The Carolinas boasted only one church in Charleston. The situation was better in Bermuda, 3 ministers in 9 parishes. Jamaica, 8 ministers in 15 parishes. Barbados, 14 ministers in 14 parishes. Maryland, 16 ministers in 30 parishes. And Virginia, 30 ministers in 50 parishes. Though Bray had some criticism for the church in those areas as well. Bray's account caught the interest of his fellow Anglicans, and in 1701 he and others secured a charter from William III to form the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, SPG. The SPG's first missionary was an ex-Quaker named George Keith, 1638 to 1716. While on his voyage to America, Keith convinced ship's chaplain John Talbot, 1645 to 1727, to join him. In 1702, the two began a grand tour of the colonies, traveling more than 800 miles from Maine to the Carolinas. Keith was a Scot who had taught at Friends School in Philadelphia before his conversion to Anglicanism. He brought the certainty of a new convert and a willingness to engage in controversy that would mark many of the SPG missionaries who would venture into dissenting strongholds. In Boston, he criticized the graduates of Harvard University for defending the doctrine of predestination and engaged in a pamphlet war with Congregational Patriarch Increase Mather, 1639 to 1723. Keith and Talbot's journey confirmed the information in Bray's general views. The Anglican Church was almost unknown in the Middle Colonies, New England, and the Carolinas. The SPG would send the great preponderance of its missionaries to those areas, though it sent a few to Virginia and Maryland. In the years between 1701 and the American Revolution, the SPG would help support 2 persons in Virginia, 5 in Maryland, 13 in Georgia, 33 in North Carolina, 44 in New Jersey, 47 in Pennsylvania, 54 in South Carolina, 58 in New York, and 84 in New England. Missionaries went both to the English colonists and to blacks, Indians, and immigrants from other European nations. The Society's records indicate that the missionaries ministered to 6 European and 14 Indian languages. Most, but not all, of the SPG's support went to white male clergy. Exceptions to the rule included Society support for Harry and Andrew, black evangelists in mid-century South Carolina. In addition to their efforts in the colonies that would later become the United States, SPG missionaries also went to other British holdings in the Western Hemisphere: Newfoundland, 1703, the West Indies, 1712, Nova Scotia, 1728, the Bahamas, 1733, and Honduras, 1733. In the second half of the 18th century, the SPG would also begin work in Africa and the Pacific. The Society's instructions to the early missionaries conveyed the reasonable tone of enlightened Anglicanism. Missionaries to heathens and infidels were to begin their instruction with the principles of natural religion, appealing to their reason and conscience, and thence proceed to shew them the necessity of revelation, the certainty of that contained in the Holy Scripture, by plain and most obvious arguments. SPG missionaries were to employ both natural religion and revelation in order to bring others to the Christian faith. Logical arguments were not, however, the only tools that colonial Anglicans used to portray the alliance of reason and revelation. Even the design of their churches bore witness to the relationship. In the first half of the 18th century, most other Protestants met in barn-like rectangular meeting houses, most of which were entered through a door on their long walls. Colonial Anglicans were, in contrast, attracted to the new designs that James Gibbs, 1682 to 1754, was employing for Anglican churches in England. By replacing freestanding bell towers with steeples that rose from rooftops, Gibbs was able to construct churches with unobstructed facades. To these he introduced columns reminiscent of the classical Roman and Greek designs. The resultant pattern was a marriage of Christianity and classical thought, the architectural incarnation of the hopes of Christians of the moderate Enlightenment. Anglicans introduced the design in the colonies, and other denominations soon imitated it. Not all the colonists were receptive, however, to Anglican influence. The SPG recognized this fact, warning missionaries that they would need to defend the distinctive principles of the Church of England against the attempts of such gainsayers as are mixed among them. The major point of controversy, one about which George Keith and Increase Mather were already debating in 1702, was the episcopacy. SPG missionaries defended the institution from the criticism of Protestants of denominations that had rejected apostolic succession. George Keith and others sent to America relied upon a well-laid argument that Thomas Bray had already advanced in his catechetical lectures. English Protestants of the 17th and 18th centuries explained the gospel by comparing it to an Old Testament covenant, a contract in which both God and the believer agreed to fulfill certain responsibilities. In the new covenant of the gospel, God promised forgiveness of sin and everlasting life, and the believer promised repentance and faith in Christ. Bray was one of a number of post-Restoration Anglican authors who suggested that baptism by a priest in apostolic succession was the appropriate way to accept this covenant agreement. Episcopacy was, therefore, a necessary element of the covenant. The episcopate version of covenant theology would prove extremely useful to generations of Anglican clergy. The Society's first parishioners in New England and the Middle Colonies were Anglicans who petitioned the SPG for help in the formation of congregations. Initially, many of these were among the poorer and less privileged inhabitants. 18th century Connecticut tax rules indicated, for example, that 2/3 of the Anglicans in that colony were residents of rural areas and that the percentage of poor was higher than among Congregationalists. In western Massachusetts, a number of Dutch settlers who felt unwelcome in Congregational churches were active in the formation of early Anglican parishes. In New York City, many early converts to the Church of England were Dutch-speaking graduates of the SPG Charity School who had received instruction both in the English language and the Book of Common Prayer from schoolmasters William and Thomas Huddleston. In 1722, Anglicans made their first inroads into the New England upper class. In September of that year, 7 faculty members of the recent graduates of Yale College signed a statement for the Yale Board of Trustees indicating doubt of the validity of persuasion of the invalidity of non-episcopal ordination. The 7, all of whom were Congregational clergy, had met in an informal book club to which they had also invited George Piggott, an SPG missionary in Stratford. Piggott called their doubts on the question of episcopacy a glorious revolution of the ecclesiastics of this country. 4 of the 7, Yale rector Timothy Cutler, 1683 or 1684 to 1765, tutor Daniel Brown, 1698 to 1723, former tutor Samuel Johnson, 1696 to 1772, and recent graduate James Wetmore, died 1760, sailed to England for reordination. Brown died of smallpox while in England, but the remaining 3 were ordained and assigned to American parishes by the SPG. Cutler to Christ, Old North Church in Boston, 1723 to 64, Wetmore to Rye, New York, 1726 to 60, and Johnson to Stratford, Connecticut, which was left vacant when Piggott moved on to Rhode Island. The contributions of the 3 men were not limited to the individual parishes they served, however. Native-born and well-educated, they provided needed leadership for the small Anglican church in New England and New York. Samuel Johnson, for example, served for 9 years, 1754 to 63, as the first president of King's College, Columbia, in New York. The Congregational Church was the established church in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. As was the case with the Anglican Church in the South, the Congregational Church in New England was tax-supported. As the Anglican Church made steady gains, however, the New England legislatures made some concessions. In 1727, Connecticut exempted all Anglicans living within 5 miles of Anglican church buildings from paying state church taxes. Massachusetts passed similar legislation in 1735. Thomas Bray's SPG, now the USPG, United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, as a result of a 1965 merger with the university's mission to Central Africa, and SPCK continues their activities in the 20th century. A third missionary society, however, would function only until the American Revolution. Dr. Bray's Associates, as the organization was called, secured a charter in the year of Bray's death, 1730. The organization's efforts were directed to evangelization and education of Black Americans. It supported schools for blacks in Philadelphia, 1758 to about 75, New York, 1760 to about 1774, Williamsburg, 1760 to 1774, and Fredericksburg, 1765 to 1770, Virginia and Newport, Rhode Island, 1762 to 1775. While male clergy served as superintendents of these schools, most of the actual instruction was given by white school mistresses such as Anne Wager of Williamsburg. After the American Revolution halted all ongoing projects, the society's managers devoted its assets to charitable projects within England. When in 1724, Bishop of London, 1723 to 1748, Edmund Gibson, sent a questionnaire to Anglican clergy in American colonies, he found that the condition of the Anglican Church had markedly improved since Thomas Bray's General View, 1698. Bray had found approximately 85 Anglican churches, of which almost all were in Maryland or Virginia. Gibson's survey, in contrast, noted 161 places of worship, ranging from South Carolina to Massachusetts. The survey included replies from Virginia, 60 places of worship, Maryland, 45, New York, 17, South Carolina, 14, Rhode Island, 8, Pennsylvania, 4, New Jersey, 7, Connecticut, 3, and Massachusetts, 3. Respondents reported that their churches were full. In Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina, parishes for which complete data were available, the majority of the population attended worship regularly in the Anglican Church, and approximately 15% of the population received communion. The latter figure was 3 times higher than that of parishes in the English Diocese of Oxford. The Anglican Church's growth in influence and numbers would not continue uninterrupted throughout the century, however. 2 important events, the Great Awakening and the American Revolution, would soon leave lasting marks on the denomination.